Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Unstructured Unlocked. I'm co-host Michelle Gouveia,
And I'm co-host Tom Wilde.
and we are excited to be joined today by Ian Thompson, a freelance strategic advisor to the insurance industry. Ian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Tom. Delighted to be with you today.
Really excited to talk to you and hear your thoughts. Before we jump into the first question, would you mind sharing a little bit about your background?
So I've been around in the insurance industry for about 30 years, doing a variety of different roles. And I guess over the last 20 years, I've more focused on claims from a strategic perspective, but also done operational leadership. And then over the last 12 years, my last role was with Zurich Insurance, increasingly global roles and executive level roles, always with a focus around change, development, and customer.
Great. Well, welcome, Ian. So I happen to be broadcasting here today from the Guidewire Connection show. So a lot of this is very timely, as you get to be exposed to a lot of interesting innovations in both claims and underwriting at a show like this. With your perspective on the advancements in sort of the application of technology in claims, where would you say we are today? Is this been a linear process of improvement over the last 20 years? Is there really an inflection point? Certainly I've seen, virtual car accident reconstruction technologies, and certainly all of the sort of spatial and satellite imagery that you see coming into both personal lines and commercial. But curious what your perspective is now that you're a bit sort of one step outside of the industry, looking back in as an advisor. Kind of how do you see if you were going to start us off by painting the broader picture?
Yeah. So I don't think it's been linear. I think there's been certain points at which it's kind of pushed the game forward. I kind of think of claims as like, when you see those athletes training and they've got a parachute behind them and they're kind of running against that. And I think there's a lot of desire amongst claims leadership to actually evolve the model and develop stronger. But the things that are holding companies back and teams back from actually making the changes they want to make.
If you were to create some bullets around what is holding them back, what is that parachute today? That's a good set of discussion topics we can dig into today on the podcast.
Yeah, sure. So look, those are many faceted, and sometimes it's linked into markets and particular norms. I think there are, in more mature markets, you're at Guidewire. I mean, I'm sure all the talk is about legacy systems and things like that, but it is true. The investment that's gone before can actually be a constraint. And I've seen companies going down two routes around this, which is replatforming, and therefore saying we'll then innovate on top of that, particularly around AI or more agile ways of managing the claims and interacting with the customer. Or you've got others that are actually going to say, they're saying, do you know what? We're never going to change that legacy environment without a really big capital investment. So we need to build on top of that and create a more agile interface for our people, for our processes, for our data, and for our customers. So those two things are definitely happening. So there's that legacy piece. I mean, always within organizations as well, you've got that prioritization for capital. So where does claims fit in the strategy? I mean, I'm sensing a bit of a sea change because I think over the last few years, we've maybe gone backwards a bit, and kind of claims gets categorized as a back office function, which quite honestly really, really gets my goat when I hear that phrase being used, because claims is there to deliver what the commitment has been for an insurance company. So, but at the same time, sometimes it's wrapped within operations, and therefore people really don't get that claims is not just around a hell of a lot of cost of people. And yeah, sure, the customer piece, but 80% of the money that goes out of insurance companies goes out in settling claims. So there's a lot more to claims than just, an inefficient operation, processes that deliver for the customer.
Ian, I'd like to ask maybe a variation of that question. I know very well that these two things are tied together, but innovation in claims in the next 5-10 years, do you think it's going to come more from, I'll use the transformation word, transformation in the platforms that are being used, or a change in the way the workflows are constructed that are going to be the primary driver of innovating how claims are managed and handled?
No, I think it's going to be externally driven in two ways. I think one is the customer angle, and When I say customer, I mean commercial clients as well as retail customers, because actually some of those demands are the same. I want the information instantly. I want a decision really quickly. I want to be kept informed along the way. I don't want to be my own project manager. These drivers are going to force a transformation and an evolution in the way that the claims service is delivered. So, I think that's where it's going to come from. I think the other thing is now, if claims executives and insurance executives are not getting the need for change from internally, people coming into the industry now, our newer talent coming in and are looking at some of the platforms they have to deal with and some of the ways they have to interface. And they're going, geez, I've got better technology at home in my bedroom than I've actually got on my work platform. So you've got to attract people in and you've actually got to have them interfacing in a way which they feel comfortable with. Otherwise, they're going to walk.
How do you think about that sort of pane of glass challenge that you just brought up with newer people coming into the workforce? I know that in talking to some customers, they often bring up this question of, well, we don't really want another application interface. And then I'll find out that they have 140 applications. And I always feel like, well, clearly someone kept adding application interfaces. But there seems to be a tension between sort of an end-to-end application experience and best in class or legacy solutions that have to be part of that process. Where do you think we go next there? Is there a desire to move towards end to end, or will we still be in this world of either best in class or there's just an enterprise architecture reality that there's legacy systems that have to be made part of these processes? How do you sort of reconcile that?
Sure. I think, look, end-to-end process transformation to me is a kind of holy grail. We all want to get there. We all want to make sure that it is the slickest, the most effective in managing the process, delivering for the customer, and the best to interface from a people perspective. But again, those things are dragging us back is in terms of that infrastructure we have. And look, again, when I look at a global perspective as well, you see different things in different markets, and you kind of have to recognize this, that in some cases, the kind of things that hold back in terms of full process, end-to-end process optimization is distribution models. So we can think all we like about inside, but if it's an agent-based model or a
Yeah.
broker-based model, there are other people to kind of bring to the party to bring to get alignment, and that's not always easy. You've even got some of the things in terms of that maturity of the insurance company itself. It's way easier to be in a less mature market or being in a space where you think you can really break some new ground from an insurance perspective and do more of a ground up development and start to think about how you start with the right approach from the beginning rather than try and build something back on top.
And maybe just building on that, one more point, and then I'll turn it back to Michelle. My observation is that a missing function, role, or focus within the insurance enterprise as part of digital transformation is there seems to be generally sort of a lack of what I almost call product management. Maybe you could call it program management, but I often don't see someone who sits down and says, I'm going to own that claims, adjuster experience and really drive transformation from that person's perspective. Instead, there seems to be more kind of siloed, well, I own this piece, I own this piece, I own this piece. And there isn't kind of the wringing out of the internal digital transformation. I think a lot of energy on the external digital transformation and user experience design and portals and things like that. Do you think that's fair? Is that a broader observation that you think applies, or maybe I've seen a different sample size?
No, I think it is fair. And I think this is where organizational structure and business model again comes in, because you kind of break things down into somebody who owns the operational piece of that, but then you've got somebody who's responsible for the technical piece, which may include elements like, I don't know, fraud detection, vendor management. They start to kind of go, well, actually, this is my piece of the process. And then there's the unsexy bits that people don't really focus on, like payment processing, which probably isn't owned in claims, it's probably owned in finance. So you've got all of these different bits, and then you throw in the bit that it's got to be regulatory compliant, and then that means somebody else is kind of coming in and saying, well, it needs to be this, it needs to be that. But I think if you've got a really effective claims leader, they get the right people around the table and they go, right, how do we solve this? And you've got to map it, and you've got to map it at the right level that makes sense. Start to unpick those complexities, but always with the challenge which says we don't start from where we are, we start from where we want to be and work backwards. And then you start to tackle some of those things around, we tried it before, it doesn't work. No, we can't change that because this won't. Do you know what I mean? You've seen it, Tom, you've heard it
Yeah.
before.
It sounds more like you need to understand the business outcome you're trying to drive rather than just throw a lot of technology or things on top of it and hope that it gets you to some outcome that is more net positive than what you're at. I think just going back to something you touched on in answering Tom's question is, mapping everything out and really understanding the regulatory environment that you're in and the constraints or things you may have to do for carriers that are global, right, and are running claims organizations and and creating workflows in different geographies. It could be United States, different states, or it could be, the US versus Europe, et cetera. What are your recommendations there for trying, because obviously carriers are trying to have some sense of commonality, whether it's a tech platform or a workflow or a process, but obviously there are exterior influences that are going to affect how they're able to execute some of that.
Yeah, sure. So I touching back a bit on one of the things I said around that kind of business model and maybe distribution. I mean, that will vary from country to country. And, there's places in Europe that are very agent driven for a lot, certainly of the retail, but even some of that kind of mid-market kind of commercial. That makes a difference in terms of how you can interface and therefore how that drives the way that you can operate. You've got customer behavior. So what platforms are people used to actually interacting on? So there are plenty of places in which, we can assume in the US or Europe that everybody's kind of interfacing via a laptop or a pad or whatever. There's actually plenty of countries around the world who skip way past that. And actually you take places like Turkey, where I think average 3 phones per individual, everybody's actually seeing the phone as the main point of interface. So you've got that. And then you've got market maturity coming into play as well, which is actually those places where there's been an insurance industry for 150 years tend to have that baggage about how things are done, whereas the newer markets actually have gotten a dynamism. And that's kind of reflected around that data piece as well. I mean, outside of the US, one of the biggest piece of data regulation is within the European Union, the General Data Protection Regulations. This is one of the kind of key differences that you'll see if you're not used to operating in the European Union, is that focuses around data of European Union citizens wherever it is handled. And that is something that people kind of get quite surprised about. Oh, well, it's fine. We can operate it out of wherever we might have put our data center or wherever we might be doing our processing. Nah, you got to really watch that and think about that control. And that GDPR structure is actually being adopted in places like Japan and other countries as well. So that focus around data protection is seeing almost more homogeneity kind of coming through. Whereas my sense in the US is that it's still very much a kind of a state by state approach, and the level to which that is applied consistently varies quite a bit.
And there's sort of pros and cons there, right? I think in the US, it's a bit shocking how much sort of personal level data an enterprise can access to augment these processes, and so in a way that's helpful because it allows you to possibly adjudicate these claims faster, detect fraud more robustly, but at the cost of, just a very, very sort of invasive level of data that can be aggregated on any individual. And I think the average consumer still isn't aware of just how fine-grained, a US profile that can be assembled with a very small amount of sort of key data, right, to start with, be it an address or a cell phone number or something of that nature. Europe, as you point out, on the other hand, is much more restrictive there. It's much harder to assemble these sort of data profiles of either firmographic or demographic. So that carries with it, obviously, the challenges of accomplishing some of the things that I described that are unlocked by it. So how do you think about those differences? How does a European carrier solve that while being compliant? And how does that change how they approach things like, claims adjudication?
Yeah. So look, I think what has become obvious is that the European Union is using this as a basis to allow actually more freedom of movement within the European Union, because if you're holding the data within the European Union state, then you're actually able to process that. So I think that is one of the things to think about here is what is the focus of the regulation? Clearly, it's protection of personal data, but there's an element of which, you could argue this is commercial protectionism as well. So, when it comes down to things like fraud detection, there's other pieces. I'm not sure how much of a real difference it makes because it doesn't restrict collaboration between organizations or within markets. So if you take the UK, for example, and the fact that there is sharing of data between different insurers within a common structure, fraud-related information, which is way more powerful than any one individual carrier can achieve or individual counter-fraud platform can achieve as well. So as you said, there are pros and cons with the models, but both can be adapted and both you can find success in.
This topic of data is really interesting to me because in my day-to-day, and I think in the industry in general, when you hear people talking about data and data ingestion and having a solid structure to leverage AI and other capabilities on, it may be maybe a bias of mine or an interpretation incorrect or not, but it seems to me that everyone talks more about the data from an underwriting perspective, right? How do you pull in the data from the submissions? How do you augment that with third-party enhancement? And there is a lot of data in the claims workflows, right? Data that you're leveraging, data that you're getting in as part of the claim. And I think there's less emphasis there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how can the data that is collected during, the handling of a claim be structured, be taken into, then help kind of in the front end of all of those workflows. I guess I'm bringing it back to underwriting, but improve the overall cycle, because obviously at the end of the day, everyone wants to provide a good product, but they also want to and claims where they can. So I'm just curious your thoughts on data utilization as it comes from the claims workflow itself.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great point. And quite often when we talk about underwriting, actually, we're talking about pricing and actuarial pricing and leveraging the data for that, because that's the competitive edge. But also within pricing is you're actually trying to collect enough premium to be able to put the reserves at the right level. And this is really fundamental for the solvency of an insurance company, and everything that goes alongside that. So the claims piece of that fundamentally has been undervalued. Underwriters have understood and decided which particular components of data that they're interested in, and that's what they've tended to utilize. And of course, when you're an underwriter, you're essentially kind of looking back over history to project where the future is going to be. So the extent to which you actually go, let's pick up some new data sources, is kind of linked into, and how far back can we go with that new data source we're going to pick up? So the fact that claims is actually sitting on a mine, a diamond mine of information, but like any mine, it's like a mix of muck and everything that you don't really want, and then there's the shiny, valuable bits within inside it. And so much of that is held within unstructured data. But also because of way claims operates, the files are there with that data in going back for a while. The question is how do you actually get into that data? How do you pull those data pieces out? Because going back into some of the challenges of the claims platforms, a lot of claims platforms are not claims platforms. They're actually data collection front ends to underwriting systems. And that means the underwriter's gone, this is the data we want you to collect. And therefore that's what the fields collect. You can't necessarily then add in another 20 fields you want to start collecting data on because they're not fundamentally structured within that. So this is where I think, one of those points we were going back to earlier around, the legacy and versus, more agile, where the opportunities are for organizations. Maybe we can think of one, Tom, to actually kind of, get into unstructured data and starting to pull out and leverage that and to make it way more valuable. Because, going to that point purpose, what is the purpose of a claims organization? Sure, you can say it's around meeting the needs of the customer, but one of the core purposes is to make sure that you manage the claims right, you collect the data right, so ultimately you're reserving right. Because the worst, people used to say to me when I was in my global claims role at Zurich, it's like, how do you sleep at night? $20 billion. And it's like, wow. And it's like, I don't worry so much about what's going on day to day. It's if there is a systemic failure of our capture of the information that impacts on the actual reserves. That's where there would be trouble for the company, with the regulator, with the brand, and with confidence.
Yeah, I think on that point, what continues to strike me and where, customers really are turning to us are critical sources of data like loss runs, like bordereau, like SOVs, which today are still shipped, via Excel and scanned PDFs, to be honest, not in a ready state to assemble and create a sort of analytical advantage, going back in time to make intelligent judgments there. And I've had customers say to me, a lot of times we feel like we're operating blind, which is frustrating because we know the data is there, but we can't access it. And, so it's very much this Tower of Babel problem, right? I think people don't realize, I've had this conversation with people outside who don't live the problem. There's an idea that, well, it's pretty easy to compare, 100 different spreadsheets and normalize them so that I can access them in a data set. Absolutely not. It's incredibly difficult to do such a thing. And now if you assume that those are, living on scanned PDFs, you have a whole nother level of challenge. So this sort of unstructured challenge, solving that is really one of the keys to unlocking. You and I have talked about this, Ian, unlocking this sort of connection between claims data and underwriting and pricing, which today is still kind of siloed and not easy to do, which is, shocking and critical for the business, the health of the business.
Well, no, 100%. And I think it's interesting. Sometimes the solutions that I've seen presented is, well, surely you can just get the claims handlers to collect some extra data, And I've seen, in my career, the claims handlers with a sheet of paper next to their, their desktop, literally doing 5-bar gate counts on, how many of this type have we got because it's not within the system. And Tom, absolutely right. Getting more sophisticated around this is part of the untapped value that from claims. And to the point earlier around where do we see things going? I think that leverage of the data way more effectively and recognizing how you need to start pulling that in both from historical sources, but you have to start somewhere in terms of that collection of what you're getting in now as well.
Yes.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit, Ian, to as you said, people categorize maybe mistakenly or not totally correctly. They move claims into the back office automation side when really your claims is part of delivering a service, right, to the end consumer or the insured. And where I have heard a lot of demand for data or training capabilities as it relates to claims is people wanting to leverage AI or chatbots to automate an initial interaction, right? And to do that, you need to have a foundational understanding of the policy, the claims workflow, et cetera. How do you think about call center automation as part in terms of ultimately innovation in the claims workflow? Is it a positive thing? Is it something that you would caution carriers to do because you're potentially removing some of that human to human interaction? Like, where does that, and obviously there's the layer of AI in all of this as well.
Michelle, it's a great question. And I think one of the things that you've just said is really important, which is you can't take away the option of the customer to speak to somebody. I mean, if that's the product they sold and they've been told that they'll never, ever get hold of a human being if they ever want to get hold of one, but we've all got products and services. We kind of didn't realize we were buying like that. And then when you actually try and get hold of somebody, you just go into these closed loops of stuff through the website that you have to do. And it's just more and more frustrating. There's an emotion attached to an insurance claim, which means ultimately somebody's going to want to talk to a customer's going to want to talk to somebody. So you can't start by saying we'll cut out all human interaction. What you can do, though, is two areas to this. One is give customers the choice for self-service and allow them to capture data and to interact with you, which says that when we speak to you, you've already got a lot of the information that we need in front. And, you can use that to kind of turn the usual way of interfacing the customer calls, the call center, into actually, thanks for doing that. We're going to give you a call back between 9:30 and 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and we're going to talk it through with you, which to me is way more of a service than kind of hanging in a queue for a while, waiting for the right person while some, 1980s music is playing. So, there's that piece. Then you've got the processes. there is a huge amount of mundane activity within that first notification of loss process. Some of that is because the handlers are looking at a question set on screen, which, they're quite often, let's go for the first thing. They may be actually having to sift through a whole range of different policy covers, trying to find the one that's appropriate to this particular customer through this particular intermediary for maybe, sold through this particular special arrangement. And they're searching through that and trying to find out whether or not the policy is valid or not. There's a huge round of opportunities around, matching policy coverage to the situation of the claim and taking that stress away from the handler. And then you get into what are the main, the mundane aspects of that. Yeah, another straightforward one is it's like customers go all the time. Why do you have to keep asking me the information that I've already told you? So multi-channel integration, sucking in information as well that's already held on policy systems. That's helping. And then when it comes to the process, there's lots of tasks there around moving stuff around, filling in forms, and ultimately, triaging and pushing on things around workflow. It stuns me that still even basic workflow management tools aren't, as sophisticated as they could be just within that first notification of loss process.
I think there's some fun stuff that's ahead on that, where just recording an FNOL call and having Gen AI do a trial run of extracting what the key value pairs that you're really looking for to inject into a claim center or other type system, that's probably near-term feasible, right? And so you could even imagine the consumer or the claimant simply leaving a voicemail and then getting an email back saying, "Hey, this looks like the FNOL that you just filed. Tell us where we got it wrong," to further reduce that friction and maybe allow to capture more data without annoying the claimant, right? Because they can just verbalize what happened. So I think there's some fun stuff like that that's around the corner. Great. Well, thank you, Ian. That was a fascinating conversation. We've been talking to Ian Thompson, a 30-year insurance veteran and a 20-year claims experience expert. I really enjoyed the conversation today.
I enjoyed the conversation too. Michelle, Tom, it's been a pleasure.
Great to have you, Ian. Thanks for the enlightening conversation. Really appreciate it.